This project seeks to reach back in time over the span of my own life that began in a rock house bedroom of my maternal grandparents on November 3rd, 1941. My mother and cowboy father had been married a couple of years and followed the normal pattern of calling in the country doctor to my mother's parents' home out in the country when it came time for me to be born. My parents were beginning life together soon after graduating from high school, with my father taking a job working on the Harvey Marks Ranch just north of Perry in the southern part of Jack County, Texas. With war clouds mushrooming up in 1941, few, if any, in the U.S. knew that barely a month later, the U.S. would be at war both with Japan and then with Germany. Thus, in the most normal of ways for rural Texas in the 1940s, I began my incredible journey on planet Earth. As the first of eventually 3 children, we enjoyed a standard experience through our growing up years. Never in my wildest imagination could I have imagined in those years the kind of journey that began unfolding for me that eventful day in 1941. With very dedicated Christian parents, the nurturing of my life would be within the framework of sincere Christian commitment. What I did not know for many, many years was that my maternal Pentecostal grandmother began praying for me to be called of God into Christian ministry. Of course, she assumed that it would be an Assembly of God-based ministry. Instead, it turned out to be a Baptist-based ministry. God clearly has a sense of humor in answering our calls and our prayers. From this very normal beginning in 1941, my life evolved in quite a number of unusual ways, as I have come to understand over the years. First, although born into a very poor family in rural life at the edge of West Texas, I would eventually travel to many other places both inside the U.S., in Europe, and in Central America. Parents keenly anxious for their children to have a better life, and also an insatiable curiosity about the new, the strange, and the unknown, has served as platforms for God to be better able to direct my steps in this curious journey into unexpected places. The first 18 years in Perrin were spent in lots of hard work on a farming and ranching operation of my father. A big trip for me was to get to go with my dad and uncle carrying a truckload of cattle to the Fort Worth stockyards, some 75 miles away. My undergraduate college years in 1960 to 1964 began in the piney woods of East Texas at Marshall, but after 1 year switched to the South Plains of Plainview, Texas. There I graduated in 1964 with a Bachelor of Arts degree, majoring in religion and minoring in English grammar. Language and language studies were rapidly becoming my thing. My oldest son, Chris, was born during this time in Plainview. The seminary study years began in August 1964 at Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary in Fort Worth, but were financed by becoming pastor of the Baptist Church at Grayford, Texas, where for 4 years I commuted back and forth to Fort Worth 4 days a week, making the 150-mile daily round trip. The second son, Donald, was born while at Grayford. The successful completion of the Master of Divinity, or MDiv degree, opened the door for doctoral studies in 1968, and also the opportunity to become senior pastor of the much larger Springdale Baptist Church, also in Fort Worth. The third son, Greg, was born during this time. In 1974, I became professor of New Testament and Koine Greek at the seminary. This was my calling through December 1997. In December 1997, Claire and I moved to Boiling Springs, North Carolina, for me to become professor of religion and Greek at Gardner-Webb University. In 2008, retirement from teaching brought a move to Germany and then subsequently to Costa Rica, doing volunteer work in both places. The beginning at Perrin in 1941 reflects a normal pattern for lots and lots of rural kids in the U.S. After being born at my grandparents' home, a couple of years later, my father's rancher boss loaned him the money to purchase the Goddard place, about 3 miles southwest of Perrin, and most importantly, across the creek from my mother's parents' place. This new home, along with the purchase years later of an adjacent 80-acre place, would be home for my family the rest of my parents' lives. Life was challenging then, with growing up in an old clapboard board house with 3 rooms, a bedroom, a living room, and a kitchen. We grew up in poverty even by the 1940s and 50s standards. Wearing hand-me-down clothes was norm. Prized possessions were the few new clothes that came just before school and always at Christmas time. But my parents were hard-working folks, with Mother always helping Daddy with the outside work, dealing with the cattle and the farming side of the operations. I can still remember Daddy getting his first tractor, a John Deere Model B, in 1947. Gladly, the workhorses were semi-retired to just plowing the garden and orchard at the house. In the summer of 1953, an uncle from Long Beach, California, installed electric lines in the house after the REA electric lines finally reached our place. My father and my sister and brother and I always had daily chores and always worked on the place, helping make a meager living in the 1940s and 50s. With the leasing of additional pasture and farmland, the operation reached a high point of around 600 acres that kept the family going with a whole lot of hard work. From the second week of my earthly life on, I have regularly been in church. Over these 75 plus years, I've missed less than 4 weeks of attendance in Sunday school and church. My father served early on as deacon, Sunday school director, and just about every other possible position. From the early 1950s, my mother became the minister of music in the Baptist church at Perrin, something very unusual for a woman in Baptist life during those days. When she passed away in 1975, she still held that position. And my father was a leader up to his passing in 1991. Our rural church was atypical in those days, with its progressive mindedness and commitment to spreading the gospel around the world. One of the highlights of my high school years was being sent, together with 5 other young people and the pastor, on a 2-week mission trip to Chardon, Ohio. God was at work in all this.